So we're going to talk about executive function today. And like I said in the update this week when I was talking about it, this is like the question that comes up for people, like, what does the transition look like to traditional school, right? How did children transition? And I always bring it back to executive function. I think that that is the thing that makes the transition easy, because they've had all these opportunities to learn executive function skills during their time in their Montessori classrooms. So the definition of executive function, right? Executive functions, collectively referred to as executive function and cognitive control. They're a set of cognitive processes, right? And actually, I think this is an interesting definition. It's a set of cognitive processes necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, right? Which I feel a little bit like it's a set of processes that are necessary to be an adult, right? Like we all have executive function skills, some of us more than others, obviously, but right, but that allow us to select and successfully monitor our behaviors that facilitate the attainment of our particular goals, right? So I feel like executive functions are super important for being a functioning, sort of successful adult. And then kind of listing those out. So executive function is the broad category. And then kind of within that, we're talking about these items. And I'm going to go through each one and then talk about how we connect it, how we make it happen in the Montessori classroom. So, so that's just sort of the plan for the day here. The development, when do these executive function skills develop? I think you'll see inhibitory control, right? Inhibition, developing in preschool. So those are for sure skills that we are working with the children to get happening, right? Working memory in preschool. And then during the elementary years, they start developing that organization and sort of the resilience, cognitive flexibility. Right. And obviously we continue to work on these executive function skills as an adult throughout our life. All right. So we're going to start with inhibition. And you guys, if at any point you have a question, you can just like unmute, because there's 10 of us. So you can just unmute and ask. Don't feel shy. Okay. So inhibition, obviously the ability to stop your behavior at an appropriate time, right? So to not interrupt, to not fly into a classroom and you know, and scream as you're entering or something like that. And we do this through a number of ways, specifically in the primary classrooms. Well, actually in all the classrooms, we have clear and consistent norms, right, of behavior. So we use, you know, reasonable voices, and we put materials back once we've taken them out, and we don't interrupt other people who are working, right? There's this clear and consistent set of norms, and we follow through on those norms, right? So it's not like we say it one day and then the next day, right? It's something else. We're just very clear and consistent norms. So that's one of the things. One of the features that I love about Montessori classrooms is people are like, why don't you have like pink tower is a good example, right? That pink tower is so enticing, right? You figure that children are working with that all the time because it's so beautiful. But we only have one pink tower in each classroom. And in part, that's because that single pink tower is going to, it encourages other children, right, to sort of resist or just to plan ahead, right? They know there's only one pink tower, right? And they can't use it when another child's using it, right? So that's sort of setting them up for that. I think another thing that helps with this is that the lessons are sequenced on the shelf. So when you go into like a primary classroom and look at the math materials, the first math lesson is on the top left, and then they kind of go along the shelf, right, in order, left to right, top to bottom, and then the next shelf will be the same. And so actually, whether children know that or not, they know that the lessons are sequenced and that they can't move to a lesson on this shelf until they've sort of had most of the lessons on this shelf. And I think that also ties in with this idea that the materials and the lessons are at that just right level of difficulty, right? So, inhibition, right? Knowing that, let's see, I had this tied together yesterday and now it's not coming, but knowing that, right, that you're targeted, this lesson is just right for you at this very moment, means that you're not as, you don't get frustrated or you don't like get bored, right? So those two things that kind of make inhibition fall apart, I think, are taken care of in the Montessori environment. All right. Well, again, if you have a question, holler. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thinking about the transition to a traditional classroom, I wonder how students react when those conditions aren't in place, right? Specifically, like when classroom norms change or when materials are unfamiliar, they can't choose their own work, make their own work plan. That's one of the things I like so much about Montessori is this, you know, as you were saying, students have to plan their own way through the classroom over the course of the day. And when they aren't off, when the day is planned,
they can't do that. Yeah. So I guess that kind of depends on when they transition, right? Because if you transition like into first grade, actually, I think my sister transitioned from like a Montessori classroom, as I recall, into first grade and would just wander around the room and get up and go to the bathroom. And the teachers were very frustrated with her because she like was behaving how she knew how to behave previously. And so she had to learn a whole new set of rules, right? But if you transition later, you're gonna like, if you the children who go all the way through the adolescent program, right? They're gonna understand that those rules change as they move through, and so they're gonna have a different experience with that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Working memory. So this is that capacity to hold information in your mind, and I think it comes up a lot in. Or I always think of it with multiplication tables, right? Because it's one of those things that I always say you have to have your multiplication tables memorized, or right? They have to be actually not in the initial memory, but in the deep memory, right? So we practice this in the primary classroom. They have these finger charts where they practice like addition and subtraction. They kind of like, they're called finger charts because they sort of they are in a grid format, and so that helps with that. But we also have like in the primary classroom, they do matching lessons with the bells where they take, there's like a set, we have a set of, actually, I don't know how many bells it is, maybe 18 bells, and there's 2 of each, right? 2 of each tone. And you take those bells and you mix them all around the classroom. And then the child has to like walk and find a tone and then kind of go around the room and find the other tone that matches. So that's working on like musical sound sort of definition, but it's also that working memory. Where was that tone? I heard the tone here, and then where did I hear the tone again, right? So those are like the memory games, like the game of memory, right? The cards too, that's the same idea. In the elementary classroom, we do the same thing actually with movement. So this is, it's interesting because we have this prefix and suffix work, for example, that where you have a chart on a wall that has prefixes and suffixes, you're kind of highlighting that idea, right? And children go to the wall, they look at the word, and then they have to walk all the way back to their desk and make the word out of the movable alphabet, right? So again, it's this idea of like holding that in their mind while they walk across the room, right? So we have lots of lessons and materials like that. The other thing that I wanted to just highlight here is in the toddler and primary classrooms, all of the material they need for a particular work is on a tray on the shelf, right? They just have these like trays, and every single thing that they need, the mat, the little tiny sponge, right? All of that stuff is on a tray. When you get into and that's appropriate for that age level, right? When you get into the elementary classroom, the materials are spread throughout the classroom. So they know they are going to work with the language material. And in order to do that, they have to get the language material off the language shelf. They have to get the pencil from the material shelf. They have to get paper from their cubby, right? Like, so they've got to collect things. And that is, that's on purpose, right? We want to increase that muscle memory. And so we have them kind of gather all their stuff from around and then bring it to their desk. Right. All right. Any questions? I'm going to keep moving. So shift, this ability to move freely from one situation to another, or to like think flexibly and respond to the situation, right? So I think of this as like the choice of work and location, which is like, we call that freedom of movement, right? And freedom of where you're going to do your work. So you can choose your work, you can choose where you're going to do it. You can, move around the classroom as you need to. And that's all set up, right? In a traditional classroom, you're in rows, you can't like get out of your desk unless, you can't go to the bathroom unless you ask, right? You don't get that, that opportunity to practice that skill. So there are going to be children who wander around the classroom and who maybe aren't, practicing, like aren't able to shift, or they get upset when some other child is sitting in there at the table that they worked at yesterday, right? They're like, I want to work there, right? But it's practicing that skill, right? Oh, well, somebody else is working there right now. Let's find a different table, right? That ability, I think, is really strong. And then the one set of materials again. So right, if they like, oh, I really want to do the pink tower, and the pink tower is in use by somebody else, they have to shift. They have to practice that, right? When you've got one, if we had 22 pink towers, right, then nobody would have to practice that. They'd always just get what they wanted, right? And then actually, I've seen this in practice, in particular in the primary classrooms around snack. Actually, it happens in the elementary classrooms too. And especially right now, like there's a snack table, right? There's only 2 children allowed at a time. And actually in the primary classrooms, they have these like necklaces that they put on when they're out at snack so that everybody else can see. But there'll be children that are like, oh, I wanted to have snack next, right? And they can't, right? Like there's a process for that. It's again back to those like clear norms and expectations that we practice. And we help them with that language, right? We say, oh, so somebody else is having snack right now, you'll get your turn next. So that again, those are all built in to practice that idea of shift in the Montessori classroom. So initiation is another executive function skill, right? This one is the ability to begin a task or activity and then to independently generate ideas, responses, or problem-solving strategies. Okay, so initiating your work, again, they have choice of work and location, right? That's built in. So they get to choose, and actually it's interesting because children coming in from traditional programs often struggle with that. They're like, what do I do now? They're so used to somebody else telling them what the next thing is that they actually are often overwhelmed by the numbers of choices in a classroom. And we have to say, well, you can choose this or this. We have to kind of limit it down for them. Another place where initiation happens, I think, is in a lot of in most of the follow-up work that happens in elementary classrooms, they're allowed to sort of choose their own problems. So like when they are practicing addition, right, multi-digit addition, for example, they just make up problems. We say, off you go practice, think of any problems you can, right? And that's actually where some of the big work happens. So they'll practice with like these problems. They'll make up whatever the multi-digit addition problems are. And then at some point they'll be like, let's do 100-digit problem. Wouldn't that be great? And they'll do these giant problems. And that's because they have that ability, right, to initiate and independently generate ideas. And nobody's saying, do these 10 problems and only these 10 problems, right? They have the sort of world is their oyster in that example. And then actually another place that I think this is practiced is in math seminars in the adolescent classroom. Actually, the adolescent classroom does a lot of seminars. I just pick on math seminars because I happen to love them. But in math seminars, they'll have questions that are not traditional math questions. So there'll be these like sort of giant, like how do we, they're always word problems, and they're problems that don't have a particular way necessarily of solving them, right? So they could be solved in a variety of ways. And then the adolescents do those problems, and then they share the answers with each other. And so they're, again, sort of generating those, like, here's another way to do this task, right? Here's another way to solve this problem. And that's a big component, a big plus of those math seminars. Questions? I'm going to keep talking. For emotional control, right? Your ability to modulate your emotional responses, right? I think one of the things that we do in Montessori classrooms is we ask questions rather than correcting. So like when a child in an elementary classroom is working on an essay, they'll, you know, maybe bring it to the guide, and they'll say, right, the guide will say, have you checked, you know, for punctuation, right? Have you checked your whole essay for, you know, spelling, right? They'll ask those questions. I mean, children, just to be clear, children will sometimes say, how do you spell, you know, this word? And they'll, you know, we will certainly show them, but we're not saying, oh, you did this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, right? We're sort of encouraging conversation through questions. I also think that the peace process in the elementary program allows for a respect of the emotional responses that children have, right? And it allows them time to sort of take a moment and then have a conversation about it. So, right, when there's an argument between two children, there's a again, this is sort of those clear norms and expectations, right? There's a process for dealing with that, where one child gets to talk and the other child gets to talk, right? And there's a moderator there, and they sort of go through this process, and being able to talk through that, right, I think is really helpful. So rather than just shutting it down, like, oh, you shouldn't have done X, Y, Z, right? The children have a conversation about it. That made me feel sad, or that made me feel bad, or whatever that happens to be. In the same way, in the elementary and adolescent classrooms, children are encouraged to put items on the agenda for class meetings. So if they feel like the noise level in the classroom is too loud, right, they can put that on the agenda for the class meeting. And then once a week when they have a meeting, they'll get to say, I feel like the noise level in this classroom is too loud, you know, most of the time. And then as a group, the whole class will try and like come up with solutions for that. So actually it's pretty great, because sometimes their solutions will be things that, like, as adults, we would never have thought of, right? But it's an opportunity to practice that, right? And then also I think that the mixed age classrooms, right, being able to model, seeing the model of older children who are able to exhibit their, you know, sort of their emotional control, who have better practice that, they can help the younger children in the classroom. There's so many things, you guys, I could just talk for hours and hours and hours, but I promised you 30 minutes. So, okay, I put these two together because they felt like they were pretty similar. So this idea of development of planning, right, to manage current and future tasks, and then also organization and organizational materials, right? So I think we do that in a variety of ways. Again, in primary, that sense of order is so strong that actually primary classrooms will generally not change the arrangement of the classroom during the school year, because it's the children's, they call it, right, they call it children's house. Those classrooms are often called children's house, and that's because it is the children's house. It belongs to them. And so they don't want to like mess with the order of things on the shelf, right? Because the primary age child, the 3 to 6 year old, is so in tune to that sense of order. And so we are really clear in those primary classrooms, right? Those classrooms aren't arranged willy-nilly. You have sections. There's a practical life section, there's a math section, there's a language section, right? And it's all very organized and in order. Another way that you're planning is in elementary classrooms. They start with work journals where they write down the date and they write down the time. So at 9:15, I had a lesson on fractions, and at 10:30 I wrote an essay, and right, like this. So they're recording their day, and that's a thing that we practice, right? Initially, actually, with those little 6-year-olds who come in, initially they're practicing like just being able to write the date, right, and then telling time, right? Those two skills. But eventually, for the 6th years that are finishing our elementary program, right, they know like that they can go back and look through their work journal and see like what they worked on Monday, and like, oh, did I have any lessons on Tuesday that I need to follow up on, and let me look back at that. And so it's this record of their day. In the elementary classrooms, actually in the adolescents as well, they all have cubbies, right, that they have to kind of keep organized. And during the weekly meetings that guides have with children, they'll go through those cubbies if they're having trouble organizing them, and they'll help them organize their work and that kind of stuff. And then I talked about this one already, that in the primary classrooms, right, that the trays are complete, and that in the elementary classrooms that they have to collect the materials that they need for a particular work. All right.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so noticing development the slide that it, the space is also related to time. I mean, is that a coincidence, or is that kind of how we?
Wait, can you say it again, Daisy? Sorry, I missed it.
Oh yeah, so on the slide, the ability to organize and plan the space is also related to time.
Interesting.
I mean, it seems like a coincidence, but it like as a child, maybe it's space, and then yeah,
that's an interesting idea. You know, that's a whole nother lecture, I think, because actually Montessori also in the elementary program, she talks about time in this really, she wants children to understand the sort of expanse of time and how long like humans have been on the earth, right? And so she has all these lessons where she's got these timelines. Like there's one called the black strip, which is a 25-foot roll of black material. And that she talks about like the development of the earth and, you know, cooling and right. So she has this huge thing where she's talking about time. And then at the very end, there's a little red strip. And that's the written, that's how long humans have been on the earth, right? So they're trying to give this perspective of like all of this time before humans arrived. And then just this little piece since we've been here. So time is actually a really big component. I don't know, I'd have to think about that. I don't actually know if those are connected on purpose. There's so much subtlety to, right? So much sort of, what do we call it? Indirect preparation, right? That happens in the Montessori classrooms that it could be on purpose. I have to look into it.
But for you, I think you said they were so related, you put it on the same slide, but
right. It's true.
So it must be.
It seems like in Montessori, I mean, the physical infrastructure of the classroom is so important. I was thinking about this in the working memory section, where there's this physical infrastructure for building working memory. And so anytime you're trying to get the students to engage with something abstract, right, like memory processes, there's a physical analog for developing that. And that seems like that's maybe what's going on with
with work journals too. Yeah. Oh, that's really good. It's great stuff. I'm always learning about you know, all these pieces that are incorporated into the work that we do, and we just do it like it's not a big deal, right? But there's so much to it. Okay, self-monitoring. I think I have 3 more if I'm remembering correctly. So self-monitoring, right? Monitoring your own performance against a standard of what is expected. So you know, this is where we in Montessori programs, we don't do grading, right? We give feedback, right? We can edit an essay, for example, if a child wants us to, if it's, you know, for a big presentation or something, but we're not grading. We're not saying you're an A, you're a B, right? So children are monitoring their own performance by keeping these work journals, right? In the elementary classroom, we have Common Core standards in the classroom, like these sort of materials that a child can look through. And so obviously, you know, a first grader is probably not going to, a 6-year-old, sorry, is not going to like look through the Common Core standards to see how they're doing against, right, what society thinks they need. But there are lots of 5th years and 6th years who are doing that, right? Who are saying, oh, I'm about to, you know, enter middle school. What does society think I need? And have I had sort of lessons on all these different things? So they are accessible. These standards are accessible to the children and they use them. And then another way that they do this is that we have actually at Oak Knoll, they're called Parliaments of the Owls, which is pretty sweet, where the classrooms get together and share, like they'll share work. So somebody did a research paper on rivers and they'll share that work. And that's an opportunity, right, to sort of see what everybody else in the on the upper campus is doing. Like, oh, they did this really cool presentation and then they did a going out that went with that, right? And I want to do that same thing. And so they're able to measure sort of with their peers, but without that grading, right? That is so prevalent. I mean, that's how we measure things, is grading. Oh, actually, that was the last one. I didn't realize that. So this is, the other thing was how we're measuring, how we do on these things. And first of all, I think we do a lot of observation. I think you guys know that, right? So we observe the children, we note when they're struggling to, like, especially like in the elementary program, right? When they're struggling to clean up their materials, right? We would sort of note that and help them work on that. And so we are, because all of these components are part of our curriculum, we are noting that as we go. I did just also want to, there's a new tool called DERS, which stands for Developmental Environmental Rating System. And it's a tool to look at the classroom, like the environment, the adults and the children in the classroom, and to see how we're doing on these executive function skills specifically. And so you go into the classroom and you observe and you answer very specific questions, and that does actually spit out a score and tells us, you know, how we're doing. And then that helps. There's a conversation that can happen between the guides and the administrator who's delivering that or who's done that DERS observation, and they can say, oh, it looks like we're, you know, weak in this area. What can we do to improve that? And so that's also another way that we're measuring it. And that is the presentation on executive functions.